Welcome to my talk. I am going to talk a little bit about my research on food sharing in New York City through the lens of infrastructure. And I started thinking about infrastructuring in part during this fieldwork, which was now in the summer of 2017 in New York, where the New York City subway was breaking down and getting into accidents almost every day. And in response, this was declared the summer of hell by the mayor, and a state of emergency was declared by the New York State governor to address the lack of care and maintenance that this vital infrastructure had received for the last 30 years. So this tells us a little bit already about how we notice infrastructure, basically when it doesn't work. But maybe there's other ways we can notice it too. And I'm kind of really interested in infrastructuring as a process that can make some emergent things or some transitions more durable and real, but also public and collective, and kind of all the nice things we associate with infrastructure. So in this talk, I want to answer what are the infrastructures of food sharing, but also what are the emergent infrastructures that are being created through food sharing. So where is food sharing innovating or inventing new infrastructures? And what role can or should municipalities play in creating these infrastructures? So first, I'll take you through some definitions and conceptual infrastructures. Then I will take you through examples through 4 types of infrastructure, and then I'll offer some very brief conclusions. So first, what is infrastructure? I think everybody knows, but just a brief Oxford Dictionary definition. It's the basic physical and organizational structures and facilities that are needed in the operation of a society or enterprise. So we think of stuff in one way or another, but we also think of stuff that moves other stuff. So Larkin describes this as built networks that facilitate the flow of goods, people, or ideas and allow for their exchange over space. And the way that scholars have approached infrastructure through the lens of theory is paying attention to those moments where infrastructure breaks down, and what are the kind of social and political processes that allow us to stop seeing it to begin with, and understanding those ways of relating to infrastructure as actually part of the infrastructure. So not infrastructure as a separate thing, but always a relation. And Amin has described this as an infrastructural turn in human geography that is a way of making sense of human beings and sociality in the city in this way that acknowledges the liveliness of socio-technical systems. And I think this liveliness and relationality is also interesting to urban political ecologists. Kaika and Swingadow describe infrastructure as a material mediator between nature and the city. You can also think of infrastructure as actually the thing or the processes and socio-technical arrangements that structure urban metabolisms to make them more linear or more circular or more sustainable or more or less environmentally just. And therefore, I think infrastructures, and other scholars think that they're very interesting to examine things like governance and decision-making and regulation and how cities are shaped along particular pathways. I think Wilson sums up these questions quite well when she asks about infrastructure. So if we're getting curious about infrastructure, we also start getting curious about the allocation of resources in collectivities. So who should shoulder the obligations entailed in providing infrastructure? Who has ownership and control, and who is excluded? And in terms of kind of opening up infrastructure beyond the material and the technical, and the kind of engineering side of things, I've found a lot of inspiration from Lauren Berlant, and how she writes about infrastructure in terms of the commons. So the commons as an infrastructure, as an idea that can actually hold the world up and kind of structure our imaginaries of the possible. So she writes, the terms of transition actually provide the conceptual infrastructures as part of the protocols or practices that hold the world up. And she says that attending to these terms is to forge an imaginary for managing the meanwhile within damaged life's perdurance. And she breaks it down in these two ways. So structure is that which organizes transformation. I think we're very well trained at attending to power structures, for example. But infrastructure is that which binds us to the world in movement. So this traditional role of infrastructure, moving stuff, but also keeps the world practically bound to itself. And I think this more or less sums up what I'm interested in about infrastructure, this social and material aspect, and in the way that infrastructure can open up our imaginaries. And with this in mind, I look at food sharing as an opportunity to actually reimagine the collective infrastructure of cities. If we took seriously the different food sharing innovations that are happening in cities, and if cities invested in those, how could cities be different? So I'll look at this through 4 different infrastructures. The first is a prefigurative infrastructure, and I use this term drawing on prefigurative politics to look at the ways that DIY urbanists are kind of creating new and novel grassroots infrastructures, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of fun and creativity, to expand our imaginary of what is possible and what cities could live and be like. This isn't in New York, but I think it's a fantastic example of kind of food sharing as a prefigurative infrastructure. So Design Studio for Social Intervention in Dorchester, they do a variety of placemaking projects and activist projects through art that help people kind of reimagine place and public space. And one of those projects is Public Kitchen, which they describe as a productive fiction that's kind of making the case for new, vibrant social infrastructures that don't yet exist, and also leading people to reflect on their own attachment and relationship to public infrastructure. I see a lot of novel infrastructures being created through food sharing. When I was in Berlin, I was really fascinated by Verteiler, their public fridges that are created as kind of open access food commons where anyone can take food that they need or donate food that they don't need. And I was really excited to see these actually popping up in New York, post-field work, but as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And these were created by a mutual aid organization to sort of practice the non-capitalist future that they would like to live in. So this kind of prefigurative fridge meets a current need of sharing food, especially where people can't be close together, but also is kind of practicing for the future. Some other interesting interventions on the other side of the slide are 2 artist-led interventions. One is this project by the artist Debbie Ullman, which is a compost box that takes the shape of a newspaper distribution box. And I see it as sort of making the case for a composting infrastructure that should be everywhere and ubiquitous in our lives. And then on the bottom of the slide is Swale, which is a floating food forest created by the artist Mary Mattingly to also kind of play with this idea that maybe foraging and sharing food in public in green spaces should also be part of our urban infrastructure and our parks and our lives. The next bit to the next infrastructure, which is green infrastructures. And these are often nature-based solutions that endeavor to make cities more climate resilient by, for example, capturing stormwater. And New York City has been forced to think a lot more about this following Superstorm Sandy, which really has ravaged a lot of the urban infrastructures, including community gardens, but also the subway system. So this green infrastructure is vitally important and can often take the form of reusing green spaces or reusing vacant spaces. And here, of course, food sharing has a historically very important role to play through community gardening, for example. And the left side of the slide is a link to the Gardens Rising project, which is a research project started by the New York City Community Garden Coalition to really demonstrate and measure their impact in creating kind of these more flood resilient infrastructures in the Lower East Side by just having green spaces where water can go, for example. But I would say something that makes these infrastructures even more flood resilient is compost. And here the New York City Compost Project plays an incredibly important role in connecting citizens to composting knowledge, to places where they can compost, and distributing free compost all over the city that has an enormous capacity to absorb water and to remediate polluted urban soils. And further, I would emphasize that composting provides another kind of ecosystem service or green infrastructure by remediating some of the environmental harms of our current linear urban waste management system that has disproportionately burdened communities of color in North Brooklyn, the South Bronx, and parts of Queens. This third infrastructure, not last one, is a social infrastructure. In many ways, you could argue these are all social infrastructures. But a quick definition here is social infrastructures are kind of these shared spaces of social reproduction that allow people to make connections, build networks, and share knowledge and resources. And they've really received a lot of public attention recently following this book from the American sociologist Eric Kleinenberg, Palaces for People, where he shows that these social infrastructures can really make places more resilient during times of emergency. I would say almost all food sharing projects have some social infrastructure. These are just two examples. One is 596 acres, which really helps people connect and organize to reclaim urban land and then eventually to really live with that land as community gardeners. That provides a vital social infrastructure for neighborhoods that lack parks or green spaces or places to hang out. And on the other side is the League of Kitchens, which is, I would say, kind of repurposing an existing infrastructure, the home kitchen, but making it more collective and shared by inviting strangers into it to share knowledge and skills and experiences around immigrant foodways in New York City. And now the final infrastructure, ICT and logistics. This is probably more similar to what most people think of infrastructure as, like these networks that move stuff around. So I'm defining them here as spatially rooted networks of information and data that facilitate the mobilization of resources, often with the mediation of some kind of internet platform or app. In a few ways that happens, 596 acres, which I just discussed in the last slide, They have an awesome map that helps people share vital information about the ownership of a vacant lot, the organizing history, who to contact, how to contact them, and really provides this hugely important archive of organizing history about vacant land in New York that enables more people to access it. So that's more on the sharing information, but I would say sharing information with the idea of not just mobilizing land, but mobilizing people around that land. Then on the other side, I have kind of the infrastructures of the food movers, as I call them. And Rescuing Leftovers Cuisine has a platform where they kind of coordinate the logistics of picking up surplus food from restaurants and then distributing it to shelters and food pantries using these little blue grocery carts, very high tech. And then there's a New York City food portal, which is an extension of Donate NYC, which is owned and operated by the Department of Sanitation. And this was created after a mandate from City Council that the Department of Sanitation develop this database food portal thing that would make it easier for people to donate food to nonprofits. And the way the portal works now is it has a fancy algorithm that makes kind of good matches between food donors and receivers who are close by, who have capacity, who have need for that food. And yeah, I'm really curious how it's working. So some concluding thoughts here. As you can see, food sharing infrastructures are being created by citizens, municipalities, entrepreneurs, and activists. And they show us, I think, how food provisioning in cities can be more collective and shared. I think they are sort of an infrastructure for an emergent urban food commons that can make that urban food commons more widespread, public, durable, equitable, I hope. But I still think that municipalities can play an even more important role in strengthening these urban food commons through infrastructures by helping them to replicate and grow. And that's where I would like to see, even more investment in things like the New York City Compost Project, which, right now is facing a huge budgetary cut. All right, that's my thoughts. Take care, everybody.